I guess we can get started here. Just before we start, I'll just let you know we will be filming the talk, but we will not film the question and answer session, so you don't have to worry about being recorded at that time. So anyway, my name is Ian Baer. I'm here to introduce our speaker, Melissa Borja, who's coming from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I will tell you that I prepared a long, elaborate introduction. But unfortunately, I wrote it in my notebook, and I left my notebook in my wife's car. So I don't have that now, so it's going to be a much shorter introduction, okay? Yeah. So in any case, what I will say now is that our speaker is newly tenured associate professor at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, in Department of American Culture, right? She's a graduate of Columbia University in 2014, and then was an assistant professor at the Staten Island College of the CUNY system in New York before moving to Michigan in 2017. And the book that her book is out now since 2023, which is based on her dissertation research at Columbia in history. So actually it's all her degrees are in history, but she's now in an American culture department and doing more recent history. It almost seems more, doesn't seem so much like history to me, but anyway, it's more recent history. So anyway, I will let her explain all her work here, but we're very happy to have her here. And I think the idea of religious change amongst the Hmong is a very interesting topic in the United States. And having had the opportunity to talk with her quite a bit this afternoon and this morning after arriving, I think she's got a lot of interesting things to say. So I'm really looking forward to this talk, and I hope you all will as well. So take it away.
Thank you. Okay, first of all, I want to make sure, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. And I understand that this is the first in-person lecture since before COVID for the Hmong Studies Consortium. Is that right?
More or less. We've had some online stuff, but not just only in person like today.
So I'm really glad to be here for so many reasons. It's an honor, first of all, to be able to share my research with a community of people dedicated to Hmong studies. It's really rare for me to be able to talk with people who care about this community and these topics, and so I'm just so happy to be here. Also, I will say that 16 years ago, I spent a lot of time in this building studying Hmong, feeling very stressed out every single day, coming to class. I was a participant in the CIASI program, and it is really surreal in a good way to be back in this building sharing my work with all of you. So thank you for giving me a chance to be back here at the University of Wisconsin in a place that's very dear to me. And here is my Hmong teacher right here. So thank you. I think it's important for me to have a sense of the people who are in this room. I know that shapes the conversation we have during the Q&A section, and it might shape what I'd say during my talk. So is it okay if we just take a few minutes for folks to say their name very briefly and what program or department they're a part of? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. We'll just go around that way. Is that okay? Okay.
Hi, I'm Brandon Theory. I'm a master's student in Southeast Asia Studies. They're at the center here.
Latu?
Hi everyone, I'm Leto, PhD student in geography.
Hi, my name is Linda. The relevant thing here is I have a certificate in Asian American Studies with the Hmong emphasis, but I'm also here for environmental studies and information science.
Hi, I'm Jamie, and I'm just taking a folklore class, and my professor mentioned that this event was happening, and I was interested in coming.
So glad you're here.
Hi, I'm Laura. I'm still undergraduate in computer science and junior analysis
Nice to see you again, Melissa. My name is Kong. I'm a assistant professor in gender and women's studies and Asian American studies.
I'm Marcy. I am an assistant professor in anthropology and Asian American studies.
Hi, I'm Surinda. I actually was born and grew up in Bangkok, Thailand. I'm a professor of economics, but not here at UW Oshkosh.
I'm Chua. I'm the Hmong language lecturer at LC.
Larry Ashman. I introduced myself already, but for the rest of you, I'm the Southeast Asian and Hmong Studies librarian here.
Over here.
Hey everyone, I'm Tom, fourth year in the Competent PhD program.
Hi, my name is Pajong and I'm an Asian language cultures major.
Amazing. Well, thank you, everyone.
Just one more thing,
Okay.
I forgot to say, if you are not on our mailing list for announcements and you would like to be on the list, you can put your name down here and I'll add you to the list. Okay, so I don't know if does anybody like to add themselves to the list?
Hmong Studies.
Yeah, I'll put it here. This over here, you can sign up later if you want. I'll just leave the paper out here.
Or we could just document it. As a good community organizer, we know that the sign-in sheet is the most important thing at an event to justify our existence and funding. So, yes, thank you all for being here. One thing that I really love is there are so many people from different programs and disciplines. I will try as much as I can to speak in a way that acknowledges that we might be coming to this conversation with different types of expertise and backgrounds. So I'm primarily a historian, as mentioned. In recent years, I've migrated over to doing a lot of work in religious studies. I would say that that's my primary academic home right now. The University of Michigan doesn't have a religious studies department. So I do work in religious studies from the vantage point of an American studies department. In Michigan, we call it American culture, and an ethnic studies program, so Asian Pacific Islander American studies. But my background really is in history, immigration history. And I come to this topic having been long interested in lots of questions related to religious freedom, American political development, and of course Asian American history, including Hmong American history. So that is my background. I think you'll see how these different conversations intersect throughout the talk. I had to make some choices about what to cover today, so I'll flag that if I wasn't able to discuss today something that I talk about in great detail in my book, I'll mention that we can talk about it in the Q&A as well. I learned I have to type very aggressively here. Okay, so broadly speaking, my research touches on a few really big questions in the field I mentioned, Asian American studies, religious studies, and US immigration history. So a lot of my work is about Hmong Americans and religious change, but I have several other research projects going on. At the center of my work are some major questions, which is how have Asian and Asian American people changed America, specifically how have they changed religious life in the US, how do people handle racial, cultural, and religious difference, and put big ideals, especially ideals of religious freedom and religious pluralism, into practice. And I think the story of Hmong Americans and their migration to the United States and their experiences in the United States over the past 4 decades offer a really important vantage point to understanding and thinking about these questions. So one thing that's important to me is taking these big questions that are at the center of the field of American political history, US immigration history, and Asian American history, and religious studies, and helping us look at those big questions from new perspectives, because I think that helps us imagine new possibilities for how to navigate these tricky issues that are at the center of our scholarly conversation, but also the center of a lot of political conversations right now. So questions about religious freedom that I explore in my research on Hmong Americans, they're relevant to how we handle questions about COVID vaccinations, for example, and medical freedom, as people say. So this is the big picture view of my work. But I want to jump in right away to the story that's at the center of my book. Here's an image that appeared on a program for a Thanksgiving celebration in 1991. Now, every year, members of the Hmong Christian Church of God in Minneapolis would gather for a very special event. They called it a Thanksgiving celebration. And unlike other Thanksgiving celebrations in the US, this day of worship and commemoration took place in May, not in November. And it was in commemoration of the turbulent days in May 1975, when the US military evacuated thousands of people from Longcheng, an airbase at the center of what people frequently call the secret war. This celebration didn't focus on English pilgrims celebrating religious freedom or seeking refuge in the United States and seeking religious freedom. Instead, this church celebrated what they saw as God's deliverance of a different group of people who came to America in search of safety and freedom, Hmong refugees. So the cover for their order of service, which is a little piece of paper handed out at the beginning of a church service to offer a description of the activities during the service, is what I found at the Immigration History Research Center. And it had this illustration, and I'll just point out a few details. You see a jet flying from Laos to the United States. There is a crucifix at the top. There is the language, "Thanks God for the saving of life," right underneath that crucifix. And emblazoned on the jet is a passage from the book of John, "I am the way." There's a lot you can say about this image. It's very rich, I think, with stories, but I like to see 3 different stories in this one picture. The first, it tells a providential narrative of Hmong migration to the United States. Looking back on their exodus from Laos, devoutly Christian Hmong refugees have routinely described their journey as the product of God's intervention. So that's one story that people tell through this image. Secondly, I think it also tells a story about how Hmong Christians, often, and Hmong refugees more broadly also, saw Christian churches as critical to their resettlement in the United States. So in the United States, refugee relief and resettlement is a public-private church-state effort. And the government relies on religious groups to implement its refugee program. So in this system that we have in the United States, and which continues today, I should add, even though we don't really resettle refugees anymore after the past month, so who knows what will happen. But in the US, Christian churches historically have played a really big role in providing the way to the United States for Southeast Asian refugees and other refugees. Finally, I think this image shows how Hmong refugees saw their refugee migration as a religious migration. Resettlement in the US produced profound changes in Hmong religious life, including the decision by many Hmong refugees to adopt Christianity. So their 2 journeys are intertwined. Making a new home in the United States involved finding a new spiritual home in Christianity, a religion that Hmong people called literally the New Way. So today I am going to talk about the story succinctly told in this image, how refugee resettlement transformed the religious lives of Hmong people who resettled in the US, to the topic of my book, Follow the New Way, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2023. Backstory, I know there are some undergrads in the room, right? So this book actually began when I was a sophomore in college in 2000, I'm really old, 2001. And I worked on it for 2 decades. It began as a sophomore paper, a senior thesis, a master's thesis, a doctoral dissertation, now my first book. My family's so glad I finally finished the book. I joke that I've been married to the book longer than I've been married to my husband. So I think it's really important. Maybe there's a topic, a question that's really sitting with you. And maybe in 20 years, you're going to be here and I'll be in the audience hearing you talk about your book. So that's my wish. One of you will be in my position talking about your research. One other thing that I just want to mention, a couple weeks ago, the book also won its 3rd prize, the Asian American Association Best Book in History Prize. So that is a prize that I'm particularly proud of because that is a home discipline for me. Okay, so religious change. Before we jump into it, I think it's worth asking, how significant was this religious change? So when Hmong refugees applied for resettlement in the United States, only a very small percentage identified as Christian. I'll get into that data later. And counting religious identity is super complicated. Happy to discuss that in greater detail in the Q&A. But in my analysis of a few thousand International Institute refugee case files, which are held at the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota, I found that only about 16% of Hmong refugees who resettled in Minnesota at the time identified as Christian. So a relatively small percentage. The vast majority, about 84%, identified themselves as non-Christian, primarily as either animist or ancestor worshippers. Again, how that data was collected is kind of weird. I'm happy to discuss the complexities of religious categories in greater detail, but I think the main thing you should know is most people who came to the US were not actually Christian. But today the Christian segment of the Hmong American population has grown, in some communities estimated to be as high as 70%. It's, again, very difficult to count, but we do know that in cities all across the US, including here in Madison, there are churches for Hmong Catholics and Lutherans, Episcopalians, Mormons, Pentecostals, Baptists. The Christian and Missionary Alliance, an evangelical denomination, even has its own Hmong district, which counted 115 Hmong congregations by 2018. So Hmong Christians are very plentiful in the United States. So precise numbers tracking religious affiliation are not available. It is actually against the law to ask a religious identification question in the US Census. And it's also just hard to count religious identification because people change religion all the time. Religious switching is very, very common. And finally, a lot of groups, including Hmong people, have a very flexible approach to identifying religion. So you might say that you are Christian and also animist. That's not uncommon. And so it makes tallying adherence really hard. I just want to acknowledge that. But even if the exact number of Hmong American Christians is not very clear, this is clear. That throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Hmong Americans were often talking about and very troubled by religious and spiritual changes that were transforming their communities and their families. So in news media, interviews, in theater, and in film, they offered a lot of frank discussion of a religious divide, that's the language that was used during the time, that threatened the integrity of the community. One activist in the Twin Cities yearned for the days before, as he put it, religion became an issue. So how is it exactly that religion became an issue? What caused Hmong refugees to experience such big religious changes? What did it mean for Hmong people to adopt Christianity and follow the new way? So to answer this question, I focused my inquiry on American refugee resettlement policies and their impacts. Specifically, I studied the Twin Cities, which was a site of energetic resettlement efforts throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and where there is a very large Hmong American population. I looked at approximately 200 archival collections at 24 libraries, conducted multilingual oral history interviews with 6 individuals in the US and in Australia, and also drew on abundant oral history collections created by other scholars and community members. So let me tell you the main arguments of my book, and then in the rest of the talk I'll focus on the second half of the book, which is really about how Hmong people experience the changes in their lives. In this book, I argued that that American refugee resettlement policies unsettled and transformed the religious lives of Hmong people in 2 main ways. First, they deprived Hmong refugees of the human and material resources necessary for conducting their traditional rituals. At the same time, the US government delegated a lot of the work of resettlement to Christian churches and institutions. So, in this situation, the public-private, church-state resettlement system created all these close and often dependent relationships between Christian resettlement workers and non-Christian Hmong refugees. And in the context of these relationships, many Hmong refugees chose to adopt Christianity. To put it very simply, the U.S. resettlement system helped introduce new religious beliefs and practices to Hmong refugees. At the same time, it made it very difficult for Hmong refugees to continue their traditional rituals, and in some places, even impossible to continue them. All of these things happened despite the fact that the resettlement program was supposed to be religiously neutral. So both government and voluntary agencies in charge of resettlement often spoke of their commitment to religious freedom and religious pluralism, and I think in many cases made sincere efforts to try to respect religious differences. However, the ambiguous definition of what counts as religion made that goal very elusive. Uncertainty about what counted as religion for the Christian resettlement workers doing their resettlement work meant that their religious beliefs and practices were kind of hard to delimit and control. And at the same time, uncertainty about whether Hmong beliefs and practices constituted a legitimate religion made Hmong traditions difficult to accommodate and protect. So Hmong people had a set of beliefs and practices that were very, very foreign to a lot of people doing refugee resettlement work in the United States, and they were unclear if it counted as a real religion, and therefore it set Hmong people up for very difficult circumstances. The changes in Hmong religious life across the past 5 decades reveal not only the impact of American refugee resettlement policies, but also the religious innovation and agency of Hmong people themselves. Hmong people adopted Christianity on their own terms and for their own purposes. Importantly, conversion was not a binary experience. Many Hmong people continued to practice traditional rituals at the same time that they practiced Christianity. Or maybe they switched back and forth throughout their lifetime. And as Hmong people adapted to life in the United States, they also adapted their Hmong traditions to an American setting. They transformed Hmong beliefs, practices, institutional forms, and even language to align with American laws and customs and Christian ideas of what counts as a religion. They demonstrated spiritual creativity and resilience as they found ways to sustain their traditions and secure rights, resources, and respect. So for my talk today, I could discuss any number of themes: how Christians do refugee resettlement work, how resettlement work is a form of ministry, how Christians responded to the religious diversity of refugees throughout the 20th century. All very important, all very relevant, especially in this moment. But I'm going to focus on the 5th and 6th chapters, which concern specifically how American resettlement policies affected Hmong religious life. I apologize, I should have gone through these slides a little bit more, but a summary of Mark arguments I articulated earlier. Okay, so although this book centers on the experiences among refugees in the U.S., I think it's important to say that the story of how resettlement policies changed the course of their religious lives offers insight into larger issues. First, migration and religion. I call attention to the intertwining of religion and migration. The case among refugees and resettlement and religious change reveals 2 ideas. First, that religious experience and change can be understood as a form of migration. And second, that migration can be understood also as a religious experience, with outwardly non-religious migration policies nonetheless producing really big religious changes. I show the importance of religion in the lives of migrants, especially one particular group of migrants, refugees. And I illuminate the importance of migration in the lives of religious people whose beliefs and practices were shaped by state migration policies. Finally, I suggest that religious conversion is usually understood not merely as a product of a migration experience, but as a form of migration experience. I think this is worth noting. Lots of times when people are doing refugee resettlement work, they attend to housing and education, but religion was also an important part of how people felt whole and were able to thrive in a new country. Second, in this book, I talk a lot about public, private, and church-state governance. So I reveal the possibilities and perils that arise when the government expands its capacity by relying on religious institutions to do its work, including by relying on churches, local congregations, faith-based voluntary agencies, and more. I show how expanding public capacity through contracts with these organizations is a well-established strategy of governance in the United States, but how these partnerships were complicated by the fact that the United States is an increasingly religiously diverse place. So you have a situation where for a long time the US has relied on primarily religious institutions to resettle primarily Christian or Jewish refugees. But it becomes a lot more complicated at the end of the 20th century when increasingly refugees are not Christian. They are Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, animist, ancestor worshiper, or none of the above. So that's an important dimension of this project as well. Religious pluralism. I talk about how putting ideals of religious pluralism are very difficult to do. Putting them into practice is very difficult to do. And looking at the case of Hmong refugees during this really critical period of the 1970s and 80s, I show how Americans tried to adapt to this reality of an increasingly multi-religious society, and how what they did during that time set the stage for what they would do in subsequent decades. And finally, the category of religion. So, Hmong Americans faced the doubly daunting task of not only sustaining their ritual traditions in America, but doing so in the context of a state and society that praises religious belonging and protects the free exercise of religion, but privileges those who have a religion that conforms to a Protestant template of religion. These issues point to this really important question that's at the center of a lot of religious studies research, which is the limitations of this Western category of religion and the difficulties faced by people like the Hmong, whose traditional beliefs and practices test the capaciousness of that category. For Hmong Americans, the boundaries of religion and the applicability of religion to their lives have been anything but settled, and religion is something they've had to claim, intentionally and strategically. So this book offers insights into the potential for religious pluralism in a nation where rights and respect are reserved only for those who have something that is seen as legitimately religious. And it reveals the shortcomings of the concept of religion. I often joke that it's not a legitimate religious studies project unless someone is actually asking, but what is religion anyway? Religion is a very complicated category. It's very specific to a legal context, to a cultural context. You don't just have it, you have to claim it. And it's a category that changes over time. And no one is really ever certain about what that category involves. So by telling the experiences of Hmong Americans, I underscore the complexities of this category and the elusiveness of religious freedom, especially for those whose beliefs and practices are at odds with established understanding of religion. Put simply, you cannot protect religious freedom unless a person has a religion in the first place, and this was a challenge that Hmong people found themselves in. Okay. So, the story. I think most of you know a little bit about Hmong Americans, but for those of you who are new to this topic, let me offer a little bit of background. The Hmong are a minority ethnic group from Southeast Asia and East Asia. During the 1950s, 60s, 70s, there was a civil war in Laos, and Hmong people in Laos fought as American allies against the communists. And when the communists came to power in 1975, the Hmong fled, many to Thailand, some were airlifted. Hmong refugees first arrived for resettlement in the United States in 1975. In terms of beliefs and practices, Hmong people traditionally practiced a set of rituals, often based in the home, that combine animism, shamanism, and the worship of ancestral and natural spirits. In Hmong cosmology, two worlds exist. There is the unseen spirit world and the seen world of human beings, material things, and nature. And Hmong rituals help humans navigate these two domains and facilitate harmonious relations between kin, ancestors, nature, and the spirit world. Shamanism offers tools to address a wide range of bodily, excuse me, I'm getting over the flu. This is my first talk since the flu, so I'm gonna try to keep going. Huge wide range of bodily, social, and natural problems. And the shaman plays a really important role in Hmong's spiritual life as a human who can communicate with the unseen world and bargain for the health of the afflicted. So how were these beliefs and practices affected by the war? Well, we know that the war threw Hmong lives into chaos, and this included their ritual lives. Amid the upheaval of war, the mass exodus from Laos, and the relocation to refugee camps, Hmong people strived to continue their traditional rituals. And to some degree they could. However, there were really big obstacles when they were in the refugee camps. Hmong refugees had limited access to animals and money needed for rituals and shaman ceremonies as a result. And they also worried that practicing their traditions might cause them to be rejected for resettlement in the United States. Maintaining traditional beliefs and practices was even more challenging when Hmong refugees were resettled in the United States, where resettlement policies also had the unintended effect of disrupting Hmong traditions. Now, before I talk about how federal resettlement policies and their impact and the impact they had on Hmong refugees and ritual traditions, let me offer some important context about Southeast Asian refugee resettlement more generally. The resettlement of refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia was an enormous undertaking that honestly historians have said were surprised it happened in the first place. Approximately 1 million Southeast Asian refugees were resettled in the United States in the last quarter of the 20th century. And refugee resettlement was also enormously unpopular. We forget that now, how unpopular refugee resettlement was throughout US history, but it was very, very unpopular. One National Gallup poll conducted in May 1975, which was just 1 month after the fall of Saigon, found that only 36% of Americans surveyed favored the resettlement of Southeast Asian refugees. 54% of Americans said they opposed it. And government and voluntary agencies knew that they were working against public opinion, and they wanted to minimize any negative effects that Southeast Asian refugees might have on the communities where they were settled. As Representative Hamilton Fish put it, the plan was to ensure that Southeast Asian refugees would, quote, not be very noticeable. So this was the context. So what did they do? Well, one they aimed to do was to scatter refugees. They embraced the scatter policy, which is the strategy of dispersing refugees all across the country. Resettlement officials, and here I'm referring to both government and voluntary agency officials, pursued this policy for a few reasons. In the beginning, government depended on volunteer sponsors who were located all across the country. And so refugees went wherever sponsors were available. In addition, federal government's primary objective in resettlement was to help refugees attain self-sufficiency and prevent the reliance on public assistance. Resettlement officials believed that they could prevent welfare dependency by relocating refugees to communities where they could enter the workforce quickly. And finally, they hoped to facilitate cultural assimilation and prevent the formation of ethnic enclaves. They knew that some cities and states were home to more refugees than others, and they hoped that dispersal would distribute the cost of resettlement fairly and minimize local backlash. John McCarthy, who was representing the U.S. Catholic Conference, explained his plan for dispersing Southeast Asian refugees in a congressional hearing in May 1975. He said, quote, "We are going to work our darndest that these communities are scattered throughout the land, not to isolate these people, but in turn not to affect our economy, our socioeconomic development, the community life, or anything else. These are beautiful people. We hope to settle them in a beautiful way." That's what he said to Congress. The reality is it was not actually so beautiful. The scatter policy broke up families. It deprived Hmong refugees of kin whose active participation was necessary for the proper practice of traditional rituals. For example, Yang Kai Mua, a Hmong man resettled in Wisconsin, recalled that the separation of his family members and the uncertainty if they would ever reunite caused his family to question the feasibility of maintaining traditional Hmong beliefs and practices in the US. He said, "We wish to do these rituals, but in our tradition, you cannot do it on your own." For him, the people he would normally turn to for help with traditional rituals were all around the world. He and his wife were in Wisconsin. His uncle, the leader of his extended family, was in Rhode Island. Other relatives were in California, and others remained in the refugee camps in Thailand. So people were all around. And because they were uncertain if they would ever be able to live together again, Young Kai and his family made a collective decision to discontinue traditional Hmong beliefs and practices. As he explained, since we came to America, each of us lived distant to each other, so we need to change to Christian. We see American refugee policies operating in another key way that imposed important barriers to the practice of traditional Hmong rituals. The preference system. It caused a ritual crisis by prioritizing younger Hmong refugees for resettlement and leaving behind elders who were experts in Hmong traditions. So Hmong individuals who had served in the military and who were employed by the US government during the war, they were given highest priority for resettlement in the United States. But these top priority refugees tended to be younger people who had less knowledge of how to conduct traditional Hmong rituals. And left behind in the refugee camps were the elders, who were the Hmong community's traditional authorities on the proper practice of Hmong rituals. In the initial years of resettlement, young Hmong refugees thus found themselves spiritually adrift in the United States, where they had little guidance or knowledge about how to conduct traditional rituals, and they were often reluctant to attempt to do rituals with which they had limited knowledge, believing that making errors in rituals could have severe consequences. The absence of Hmong elders and ritual experts had huge consequences for Hmong refugees in the US. Cesar Nang Yang, a Hmong man in Minnesota, recalled, "Back in Laos and in Thailand, we always depend on the elders who know how to do this ritual. Now, when you are alone in a foreign land and you have nobody to give you the proper way how to conduct the ritual or the tradition, you just don't know what to do or how to do it." He eventually converted to Catholicism. Third, resettlement policies shape Hmong religious life by relocating them to cities, places like Minneapolis and St. Paul and Milwaukee. Resettlement officials sent Hmong refugees to places where sponsors and jobs were available. And that was often an urban environment, often in cold places. And here, doing rituals traditionally practiced in warm climates, in rural settings, it was much more difficult. Hmong refugees lacked access to animals, open space. Moving rituals that were traditionally done outdoors to indoors was really complicated. It was much harder to do these rituals in garages, apartment buildings, hospital rooms. Sometimes it violated city regulations. Even the weather posed a problem. One man said that Minnesota's frigid winters made it difficult to practice rituals that were common in Laos. He said, "It's easier to call a spirit through an open door in a warm climate." Hmong rituals also complicated relations with American neighbors. Now, a Hmong woman and a shaman in St. Paul recalled the early 1980s wasn't easy because of the drumming, the chanting, and the noise, and it bothered the neighbor. So refugee policies did not only undermine traditional Hmong beliefs and practices, it's also important to note that they facilitated Hmong contact with other religions, including Christianity, by setting up relationships between churches and refugees. So I'm going to talk about that piece now, how the American refugee resettlement system produced pressures for religious conformity and change. This often began in the refugee camps. So for many Hmong refugees, contact with Christianity began in the camps in Thailand. There, Hmong refugees encountered Christian missionaries who provided medical care. Actually, at Ban Vinai, the main medical center was run by World Vision, a very evangelical organization that has spreading the gospel, a very explicit aim. And here is one Hmong man in front of the Ban Vinai Health Center. You can see it was led by World Vision. Hmong refugees encountered these missionaries and often associated Christians with medical care, education, food assistance, and other forms of relief. Tru Xiang recalled, "There was a Catholic church where if you got sick, if you needed a shot, they would give you a shot. And in her view, Hmong people saw Christian agencies and missions as another program there to help. But this connection between Christians and aid continued in the United States because of, as I mentioned earlier, the structure of resettlement in the United States. So in the US, refugees had even closer contact with Christian churches due to the fact that religious groups did the lion's share of refugee resettlement. Over a dozen private voluntary agencies received government grants to resettle refugees, and most were affiliated with Christian churches. So this is a graph of refugee case files from 1981, roughly the peak of Southeast Asian refugee resettlement, and it offers a snapshot of the groups that participated. The religious organizations, or religiously affiliated organizations, are colored red, and the blue are the non-religious institutions. And you can see the vast majority were resettled by religious institutions. Looking at this historically, over the 2-decade period between 1981 and 2000, again, you see, for the most part, religious institutions resettling the lion's share of refugees. So they were really critical to that work. The significance of religious institutions in refugee resettlement is actually even mentioned in the film Gran Torino. I'm sure you've all seen Gran Torino, so I reference this all the time. Blame the Lutherans. Here we go, just a little clip. Oh, I don't know if it has the sound.
Oh, maybe not.
Okay. Alas.
Just tell us what it says.
Yeah, I will just tell you what it says. At the end, she's talking to Clint Eastwood. He said, "Why are you here? What brought you here?" And she says, excuse me, there was the war. We fought for your side. We came here after the war. And at the end, she says, "Blame the Lutherans. That's why we're here." And it's kind of a joke, but it's also kind of true. Lutheran churches, along with Catholic churches, Baptist churches, Episcopalian churches, these were all institutions that were one reason why there were so many Southeast Asian refugees, especially Hmong refugees, resettled in the upper Midwest. Okay, we'll just, a hard time. Oh, here it goes. Okay. Now, how did these institutions think about refugee resettlement? Well, these institutions, I should explain, are big national institutions, organizations like Church World Service, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. They had local affiliates, and then at the very, very local level, they often partnered with congregations, like a local Catholic parish or a Lutheran church. And these churches would then serve as congregational sponsors. And these congregational sponsors often had the most contact with refugees. Sometimes they actually housed the refugees in their churches, in the homes of the priests. So there was a lot of direct aid offered by very clearly religious institutions. There was no ambiguity that these churches were religious institutions. And these churches often saw their work as religious work. I think that's important. They described it as a face-to-face ministry. They considered refugee resettlement to be a way of showing God's love to refugees. This bottom part, I think, is really interesting. And you could see some of this language repeated in some of the Muslim ban protests in 2017. Jesus, who was himself a refugee, said that by helping refugees, we are really helping him. So this language of Jesus was a refugee, and therefore we should help refugees continues to be very common today, and definitely animated a lot of the work in the 1970s and 1980s. So you have, to remind you, this big structure where you have government grants going to agencies that are often religiously affiliated, and they might operate like regular social service agencies, but at the very local level, they rely on very clearly religious institutions to do some of the most direct work with refugees. It's a very complicated system. So how did Hmong refugees experience congregational resettlement? I think it's important, first of all, to note that these churches often talked about wanting to respect religious freedom. They created all of these guides to give out to church volunteers saying, these are what Hmong people believe, this is what Lao refugees believe, this is what Vietnamese refugees believe. You have to respect their religions. To respect their religions is a critical part of showing care to them as refugees. But here was the problem. It was hard to recognize and respect Hmong religious freedom if the church volunteers didn't see those refugees as having a religion in the first place. And a lot of Christian resettlement workers sometimes saw Hmong refugees as a religious blank slate. So people who didn't have any religion at all. Or, even worse, primitive people who practiced what they considered a form of demon worship. So I interviewed some Christian resettlement workers who used that language explicitly. There was a wide range of approaches, but I think the main context of religious freedom being emphasized, but it being very difficult to put into practice when you have a community like the Hmong, who are so foreign to a lot of the resettlement workers and who have a set of beliefs and practices that don't easily conform to a Christian template of religion. That was a very tricky situation. So ultimately, it didn't just matter if the churches believed they were respecting Hmong refugees' religions. What really mattered is if refugees themselves believed the churches respected their beliefs and practices. So how did they view their resettlement experiences? So overall, a lot of Hmong refugees I interviewed and whose stories were shared in other interviews expressed gratitude for church's generosity. They often spoke warmly of their sponsors. Timothy Vang recalled, "We were so lucky. The church helped us in everything. His sponsor helped him secure employment, housing, education, childcare. Hmong refugees particularly appreciated the sponsor's kindness." Yang Kaimua said, "The friendship is number one. The church," he said, "brought the confidence and the closeness to the community." And it was in the context of this closeness that many Hmong refugees adopted Christianity. Hmong refugees frequently attributed their religious change to the sponsorship by churches. Bo Tao's conversion story typifies this narrative. She said, "When we first came here, we were sponsored by the churches, so when we arrived here, my parents went to church." Hmong refugees recalled that going to church was sometimes not optional, so there was a dimension of coercion here. CNN Gang recalled, "With the churches that sponsored us, we didn't have a choice. They sponsored us, so we came every Sunday." And he added, he, the pastor, would just come in and put us in his car and took us to church. So just from Hmong stories, it's hard to know the intentions of the sponsors when they took refugees to church. They may have wanted to convert Hmong refugees to Christianity. They also may have just wanted to bring them to church to help them find friends. Or they wanted them to build a support network or increase financial giving from the congregation to support resettlement works. So it's not clear always what the intentions were, but these nuances were often lost on refugees who were often unable to understand what was happening because of language differences, and assurances of religious freedom were difficult to communicate through hand gestures and charade games. Hmong people didn't necessarily even know that maintaining their traditional rituals and beliefs was an option. Cedar Nanyang first realized he was free to practice traditional Hmong rituals in the US when he studied Roger Williams and Ann Hutchinson in high school. He emphasized that Hmong people didn't understand their freedoms when they first arrived. He said, "We did not know the Constitution. We did not know that there's an amendment that allows people to believe what they believe and do what they do. We did not know that." In these circumstances, many Hmong refugees chose to adopt Christianity, though their reasons varied. For some, becoming American meant becoming Christian. For others, adopting Christianity was an act of respect, loyalty, obligation, and gratitude. Hiavu said, "After the church helped us, we decided, the whole family decided, excuse me, to be baptized. And I asked why, and she simply explained, because this church has helped us." But I think there's actually a more complex reason for why Hmong refugees embraced Christianity. Federal resettlement policies made it hard to do traditional Hmong rituals and practices. And as a result, Hmong people felt spiritually vulnerable. Traditionally, Hmong people have believed that spirits can cause mental, spiritual, and physical harm. These rituals were instrumental in maintaining harmonious relations with the spirit world and preventing harmful situations. But as I've shown, it was hard to do rituals in the United States because of all of the policies I described earlier. And so Hmong refugees adopted Christianity because they saw Christianity as an alternative means of managing the spirits that threaten their spiritual and bodily well-being. In their conversion narratives, Hmong people describe Christianity as a substitute for when traditional Hmong beliefs and practices were neither feasible nor effective. Hmong families adopted Christianity to ensure spiritual protection, as illustrated by the experiences of the Vang family in St. Paul. Now, when the Vang family first arrived in Minnesota, they needed to set up a household altar, a home altar that's central to household rituals that ensure good fortune, well-being, and protection. But the Vang family couldn't set it up in their new home. As the daughter explained, they no longer had my grandparents there, so my parents didn't know how to make it. Without an altar, the family felt spiritually vulnerable. They believed some protection was still necessary. Now, this family had been sponsored by a church, which provided a solution. During one visit, a church member presented a crucifix to the Vang family, which they hung on the living room wall. They reasoned that Jesus would offer spiritual protection and prevent evil spirits from harming them. In other words, the crucifix was a substitution for the altar. The daughter explained, "We believe that whether you have Buddha or whatever, you have something to protect your home. And I think Jesus Christ served us well during that time." She saw Christianity as a rational choice for her family and for other Hmong people who felt spiritually vulnerable. "It's a resource," she said. "You know, who can protect my family? Who can best serve me?" Hmong conversion narratives also emphasize the power of Christianity to heal the sick. Whew. Maybe need to be healed right now. I'm going to take a clap. I'm going to drink of water. Traditionally, Hmong people practice shamanism to mediate relations with the spirit world and ensure bodily and spiritual wellness. And Hmong converts approach Christianity with a similar objective, often speaking of their decision to adopt Christianity in terms of sickness, health, and healing. For example, Wang He attributed his improved health to his conversion. He explained, "Before I was Christian, I constantly had fevers. And after becoming a Christian, my fevers were gone. I was not allergic to any types of food. To this day, I have not experienced the same type of fevers or food allergies I used to experience before I became a Christian." In these stories, religious change occurred not simply because Hmong people believed Christianity ensured health, but because the traditional means of ensuring health, shamanism, and other rituals, were difficult, even impossible to do in the US. Without shamans and elders with ritual expertise, Hmong refugees looked for alternatives, the most obvious of which was the Christianity of the churches that sponsor them. Caesar Nanyang put it this way: "When you don't have a shaman to come and cure your family, or conduct a ritual in your household, then you are hopeless. You need someone to lean on, so the Catholic priest, the church, were the one who you rely on. And they come and pray for you, and they serve as the substitute for the shaman." Now, shamans were well aware of the fact that Hmong people in the US lacked ritual knowledge and turned to Christianity as a substitute. And Borja, a Hmong shaman in Chicago, chanted about these changes in his own family. "Now some of my clansmen come to America. None of them knows how to feed these spirits. They do not know these spirits. All my clansmen changed to Christians." To be sure, what it meant to change to Christian varied. Conversion was complicated. Some Hmong people abandoned traditional beliefs and practices entirely. But more often than not, people did both. This was often because of family relationships. It was difficult to leave Hmong traditions behind if relatives continued them. And the willingness to continue traditional rituals depended on denomination. Conservative Protestants, like people who were members of the Hmong Christian Missionary Alliance, saw practices like tying wrist strings as a form of devil worship. In contrast, Catholic and mainline Protestants saw it as a secular, non-religious form of culture that was completely compatible with Christianity, and sometimes even incorporated into their worship services. So the first Catholic Hmong priest ordained in the US actually had tying of wrist strings and all of these rituals that the Protestant counterparts considered to be a form of demon worship. So really different approaches. And Hmong people also moved across religious boundaries as circumstances changed. Maybe their grandfather rejoined them in the US. Maybe they were able to relocate to a place where there was a shaman available. So as circumstances changed, they also adjusted their practices. As these conversion narratives show, Hmong refugees adopted Christianity for a lot of different reasons, but experiences among religious change share one common feature: the imprint of American refugee resettlement policies. These diverse stories were all a response to government resettlement policies that undermined traditional Hmong beliefs and practices, at the same time that they introduced Hmong people to Christianity. Government provided spiritually unsettled refugees with a new way. Put another way, refugee policies both created the problem of Hmong refugees being unable to practice their traditions, and they also offered what Hmong refugees often saw as a solution to that problem, which is Christianity, a new way to address a ritual crisis. Particularly for the earliest arrivals, it seemed an obvious and rational response. At the annual Thanksgiving celebration, members of the Hmong Christian Church of God in Minneapolis summarized the refugee and religious migrations thusly: "Thanks God and the US government." Now I want to close with two alternative endings. While I was doing the research for this book, I kept wondering what would have happened if we had different policies, and if Hmong people had a different religious situation. So let's do a couple comparisons here. I don't think it was inevitable that Hmong refugees would have experienced these religious changes. As mentioned earlier, one of the main challenges was that not many Americans recognized Hmong traditions as a legitimate religion. So what would have happened if Hmong people had beliefs and practices that were more legible as a religion? And here it's useful to compare their experiences to Vietnamese Buddhists, who were resettled often by the same churches during the same time in the same community. They had a really different experience. The US government treated these refugees very differently. They provided religious support for Vietnamese Buddhists in military-run refugee camps. The Army actually had a special Indo-Chinese refugee religious program and hired Buddhist chaplains. And here, I think the key is that Vietnamese refugees who practiced Buddhism had a religion that both government and Christian sponsors readily recognized, respected, and accommodated. Christian voluntary agencies and sponsoring churches also actively supported the religious lives of Vietnamese Buddhists. In Oregon, for example, 2 churches arranged for Buddhist monks to visit refugee families, and in Columbus, Ohio, Catholic Charities helped establish a Buddhist temple. So I'm not saying that these religious institutions were necessarily excellent at accommodating Vietnamese Buddhists, but it was a very different approach that we see in comparison to Hmong experiences. Another question I've been grappling with is what would have happened if, instead of relying on religious institutions, the US relied on governmental institutions or non-religious institutions to do refugee resettlement. And here we look to the example of Australia. So Australia is very interesting because there, the Australian government did not use Christian agencies to resettle refugees. The government did most of the work. And the Hmong anthropologist Daria Lee explained in the Australian system that Hmong refugees did not encounter people who may influence them to doubt their traditional religion and to embrace a new one. And as a result, fewer Hmong Australians adopted Christianity than Hmong Americans. In addition, the Australian government had this policy of multiculturalism. They actively supported traditional Hmong practices. So, like Hmong Americans, Hmong Australians didn't have enough ritual experts. They didn't have enough shamans. They didn't have enough people who could play bakan. And so, citing the policy of multiculturalism, Hmong Australians went to the government and created the Cultural Lobby Program, which is a government program that actually brought Hmong ritual experts from the refugee camps to Australia. And this really helped. So as the comparison with Australia illustrates, Hmong religious change in the US was not simply the natural consequence of living in a Christian nation. Hmong struggles were very much a product of intentional government policies. And in Australia, where policies differed, so too did the religious outcomes. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. I have a cough drop.
Oh, you're plenty. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, and thank you for bearing with me. And what, honestly, was one of the toughest am open for questions and discussion. Thank you.